Welcome everybody to our Construction Next Door webinar. I am joined today by my brilliant colleagues, Berkey, Markow, and Shir. This is our go-to team here at Becker when our clients are faced with the prospect of construction next door. And we're likely to see many more new buildings going up as older buildings along Florida's 8,000 plus mile coastline are contemplating terminations, possible tear downs, and new construction going up. So we think today's webinar is extremely timely. And I guess you agree because we've got several hundred of you listening today. And as Laura said, we've gotten your questions in advance. We've looked at them. We've incorporated them into today's presentation. We should have you out of here by about 2 or 3 today. I'm just kidding. We will be stopping. We will be stopping at noon, but we will try to get to as many questions as we can. So with that, Jeremy, let's start with you. What's your perspective on this topic? Now, assuming that we don't have board members and managers and even residents who regularly attend local government meetings, how does an association first learn that there's going to be construction happening nearby or even next door?
Sure, great question, Donna. So, obviously every city has a different code as relates to proposed developments. If it's as of right, you may not even get a notice, but assuming it's going to be heard at, various boards or city commissions, then depending upon what the code says, notice should be sent out to the registered agent and or the property owners. And it usually varies between 300 and 500 feet distance from the property boundaries of the proposed development application. There may also be a physical sign on the premises. So for instance, if you're walking by a site, you'll usually see like a big yellow sign. It'll say, proposed notice and hearing, coming up in 2 weeks. So just another reason to, get out of your house or your apartment and get some exercise and see what's going on in your neighborhood. And then lastly, for those who actually want to, spend some time, you can go on the city websites, search in the agendas, search for, you'll have to know certain keywords, or you can reach out to us, but site plan, rezoning, variance, those are things you should search for in the agendas. So those are pretty much the three manners that you could, determine, what an application.
Let me just back up. Did you say 300 to 500 feet for some codes? That's the requirement to actually send out notice? That's not a lot of, that's fairly close.
That's really not a lot. I don't think I've seen a code that has more than 500 feet. I will tell you, for instance, in Fort Lauderdale, they have to send it out to the neighboring civic association, which is different than a community association. But for instance, City of Miami, lots of times they are not required to send out any notice, even for high rises, unless they're applying for waivers or variances. So you have to be a little bit more proactive. So it depends on the application and it depends on the city.
So for people listening, there may not be direct notice. It may be just what you said, keep your eyes peeled to see what's going on. Okay.
Right.
So Katie, now that an association knows that there's construction contemplated, what are the first steps they should take?
I think depending on the association's budget, a wise first step would be to consult with legal counsel. Even if for budget reasons you can't have an attorney appear on your behalf at public hearings, they can advise you on the initial steps you need to take to be mobilized and ready. Attorneys like us on the webinar today, we can help with a public records request to get a complete copy of the application and advise how the development next door may affect the association and its residents. We can open lines of communication with the developer applicant to advise of what the residents' concerns are and try to identify opportunities for compromise or concessions that would yield a better development for the association and its members. Land use attorneys educated in the space can also advise on the approval process that the developer has to go through and what the criteria of approval that have to be checked off as part of the application. And that way the association and its members are best equipped to oppose the development from those criteria. And usually those include,
I'm sorry to interrupt you for a second. You mentioned pulling the application, using a land use certified planner like yourself to do that. Will that application tell, you or the client everything you need to know about what the developer's contemplating for that project?
it depends where they are in the process. Usually the initial application is not found sufficient or complete. And so the developer will file resubmittals to try to close the loop on the county or city planners' concerns. But it's certainly a good place to start. There's almost always a cover letter summarizing the project, and then various exhibits, stormwater exhibits, site plan, renderings, landscape plans to kind of get into the minutia. Where we see a lot of associations go wrong is that they only look at the cursory cover letter, which of course, when the developer's preparing it, it's going to propose the project in the most favorable light. And it's not going to hit the minutia of a lot of the concerns that will be shared by the area residents. So it is important to pull not only the original application, but all resubmittals, all staff comments. And then if you've kind of delayed in getting engaged in this process, staff has likely already issued a staff report recommending approval, denial, or approval with conditions. So pulling all of those various pieces of the application to really know what it means for the association is always a good first step. And then also Land Use Council can help engage the city and county planner. I mentioned a moment ago the staff report. In a perfect world, you're out ahead of the proposal far enough that you can engage the city or county planner assigned to review the case and help inform the staff report before it's finalized. The residents are concerned about traffic, circulation, noise, lighting, what have you. So they're getting a complete picture as compared to just what the developer put out in the application. And then also the value of retaining an attorney like us early on is we can advise how best to oppose the application and either support denial outright or support the development being modified. And that comes in the form of expert witness testimony. That could be a traffic engineer, stormwater engineer, a certified planner who can speak to compatibility with the existing development pattern, things of that nature.
Perfect. Jeremy, let me go back to you for a second. Katie mentioned where they are in the process. Typically, how many, and I know this varies depending on the local government involved, but how many steps in the approval process typically are there, and how many of those steps are open for public input?
Great question, Donna. So almost every development application, unless it's like a single family home or two single family homes, will go to what's called like a development review committee. That's technically not an open process, but I mean, you can bully your way in there and sit in on those meetings most of the time. It's usually a round table with all the technical disciplines of the municipality, engineering, police, fire, planning, zoning, city manager, traffic, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where they really get into the nuts and bolts of the project as proposed. And then after that, it typically depends on what the application is. For instance, a variance or a waiver or a conditional use or a special exception may just go to the Planning and Zoning Board or the Zoning Appeals Board, and that may be it. A site plan, it really depends on what's being proposed. It could be a major site plan or a minor site plan. Some cities differentiate with that. It also obviously depends on the zoning and the future land use, but that, if it does have to be heard, will normally go to a city commission to be heard at least once. A rezoning will typically go, through this entire process. It normally, goes through contemporaneously with a site plan, although technically they don't have to do that. But, commissioners like to see the site plan that comes along with the rezoning to see what they're going to actually approve. So that'll normally go through the DRC, Development Review Committee, Planning and Zoning Board, which advises, and then ultimately the City Commission for two readings. And then finally, a future land use amendment, which is, I guess, the big dog of all the applications, that will have to go through all of the steps I mentioned. And then at least in Broward County, for instance, it'll also have to be heard by the county commission, heard and approved by the county commission. And no matter what county you're in, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, it also has to be sent up to the state agency as well. And they come back with comments on that. And that is typically much more involved. I mean, future land use amendment, I think minimum a year, rezoning could be a little bit less than that, just depends on the project.
Gotcha. Well, I've saved the most aggressive member of our panel for this next, my partner, Kevin Markow, the litigator, for this next question, but we've heard about the different stops, Kevin. I assume you want to get in early, right? There's some benefit to being, involved early on in this process. What are the resources you bring to bear when you're brought in early into this negotiation with the developer?
With Donna, I don't want to disappoint you or the audience. I don't know that I'm going to flash my teeth and be aggressive.
I've seen it in action, Kevin. I know what you can accomplish.
All right. Well, I can smile and make nice also. It really does depend on where we are in the process, and frankly, what the client's wishes and needs are, and frankly, what the rights are. Because Katie and Jeremy have talked about different concerns and entry into the process. And I hate to be the voice of reason when I'm supposed to be the bloodthirsty panelist, but developers and landowners have rights also. Not every development is going to be rejected, or you're going to have viable arguments to reject. So, sometimes we're going to counsel some level of objectivity as well. But even where a developer is developing as a matter of right, there are certainly things that can be negotiated. There's interaction. Good developers typically wish to be good neighbors also, and that's the way we counsel our developer clients. But I am a litigator, a business litigator by trade, but growing up at Becker and as a lawyer in South Florida and seeing the community evolve, it's hard not to get involved in land use litigation and land use issues, and I've certainly gained some considerable experience through the years here doing that, representing associations and developers. I certainly rely to a large extent on our technical experts, Katie and Jeremy, but it's all part of the process, part of the planning. If we can get involved early, what I'm going to counsel the client to do is to figure out kind of their wish list and really look in the mirror and self-assess. I mean, do we really oppose this project? What do we need? Is it truly incompatible? Some developers, some developments actually increase value and bring a benefit to the overall community. I know that we were representing an association down on Miami Beach that was near the Faena district, and there was some, I guess, a diversity of opinion among the residents and the owners. Some absolutely didn't want it, fear of the unknown. Others took a more objective approach and said, "Wait a minute, they're going to develop this into what?" And look what's been created down in Faena. So I want to be involved early on, not because I'm looking to go to court. I think people hear a litigator is involved and they have mixed reactions. Sometimes it's, oh no, they're going to drag us to court. There's going to be a lot of litigation fees. That's expensive. But having a litigator involved, will certainly help assess the rights. It can certainly, allow me or allow us to create some realistic expectations for what's achievable, what may not be, preserve the record, and hopefully be a constructive part of the negotiation. I think when you sit down at the table with the developer, it's not about, as you portrayed me initially, being the hungry table pounder. It's a matter of having a realistic and reasonable discussion. And if they see that there is good faith on the other side of the table and people are making coherent arguments, whether it's on neighborhood incompatibility, height, trying to lower a project down, thin out some density, whether or not it's being, there's so many variables, and I don't want to. I can go on.
I was debunking the stereotype right out of the gate, but you make a really important point that our listeners need to hear. This is not about being anti-development. Development in the state of Florida is incredibly critical component of a healthy economy for our state. So it's not anti-development, but it is about making sure that nearby development doesn't negatively harm existing communities. And to that extent, let me open this up to the entire panel. Katie, I think I want to start with you. What are some of those negative impacts? look, we know it can be something as minor as dust and debris, and something as serious as potentially destabilizing the structures of nearby communities. So I'd like to hear from each of you what the typical, concerns are with regard to construction going up. What are the potentially negative impacts for existing communities?
Absolutely. Well, and I think it depends very much on the proposed use coming in next door. That'll guide what a lot of these concerns are. But I think the large buckets of concerns are setbacks and buffering. How far away is the development actually going to be from the shared property line? What will our sight line be once all is said and done? Also, hours of operation for not only the construction phase, but the proposed use itself. I've seen with Starbucks and other coffee shops with drive-throughs, for example, how late is the squawk box going to be open at night? How is the speaker going to be oriented as it pertains to the neighbors? Outdoor lighting, is it going to be oriented straight down and away from the association property, or is there going to be some light intrusion expected? And that's also a concern with signage that is lit at night as well, and the placement of that signage. Something I've seen lately in the city of Tampa as well is shadowing. So for example, if you have a smaller scale neighborhood, mostly single or two-story single family detached homes, and a large multifamily or mixed use building is coming in, what does that building orientation at that height mean for the surrounding area? Are they ever going to see sunshine certain times of the year? And something that often gets overlooked too is the placement of trash and kind of infrastructure uses that support the primary use. Where are those dumpsters going to be relocated? If it's a restaurant, is it going to be a compactor? Is it going to be contained for odor and pests? And then stormwater is a big factor as well. Is it going to be an independent stormwater system? Is it going to tie into the regional stormwater system that the association might be responsible for maintaining portions of, and negotiating who's going to be the perpetual maintenance entity and things of that sort? And I don't want to steal thunder from the rest of the panel too, but
you mentioned hours of construction. What about length of the project and the type of equipment they're using, swing stages, things like that?
Yep, as well. The type of equipment used, the duration of the construction, and then also staging areas and access. So we've come to terms with the developers before too, in terms of how they route their construction vehicles to be the least impactful. And it's important to get those commitments codified in a memorandum of understanding, and ideally as a covenant running with the land, so it's binding on not only the developer today, but successor owners. Because a lot of the opportunities for negotiation with the association residents and the developer aren't going to necessarily be enforceable or top of mind by the city or county approving the zoning action, for example. So it's important to have those agreements in writing and signed off by both parties, even if they're not incorporated as part of the city and county's final action on the application.
Sure. Jeremy, what about a view? We always hear about they're taking away my view now. I used to be able to see the ocean. New developments going up, they're going to block the view.
Right. I mean, that's a tricky one. It really depends on, what it says in the code. Usually there's not like a binding section of the code that says, you can't impact my view, but many times master plans or in the comprehensive plan, they'll have, something that they're aiming for, please, don't impact views, depending upon, if you're close to the, to the coast or, an older neighborhood or something like that. So, we can take those textual, documents and run with it. Kevin and I, a few years ago, actually had a very interesting case in Fort Lauderdale where, we made the argument that, from a master plan, that it was actually a, binding text, and we actually prevailed on that for a separate, separate subject matter, relating to transition areas. But yeah, I mean, and planners are usually pretty attuned to the neighbors' concerns, and commissioners are as well. So even if it's not a legal argument that you're making, it's a public policy argument that you could make. They can always readjust the building, to impact fewer of the residents. But, you know, sometimes that just, it does get tricky. And sometimes, you know, the boards or the residents within one building that's being affected, you know, one side of the building is being affected less than another side's, or, you know, it could be that the neighbor on the northern side is more affected. So, you know, it really just depends.
But there is a possibility to potentially impact the developer's initial design once these issues are brought to light. Let's talk about change in use. For instance, we have a lot of communities throughout Florida that were private golf course communities. Now, as equity members died off and there was less and less support for those golf clubs, we've seen those golf clubs often be sold and bought by developers and developed. I know you all have worked on those issues.
And I think with those golf course conversion projects, one of the toughest things is access, because it was never contemplated to be for housing. And so there's sometimes constraints for ingress and egress that need to be top of mind, and shared stormwater. A lot of those golf courses were intended to have no density on them to allow floodplain management. So working with a sophisticated stormwater engineer and traffic engineer in those cases is especially important.
Yeah, when you're talking about a golf course redevelopment or conversion, it probably, if you're talking about going to residential, you're probably going to be a pretty significant project, hundreds, if not thousands of homes. It really does require a kind of a multidisciplinary approach. When Katie mentions ingress, egress, those are like buzzwords for traffic and traffic impact study, and there's a lot of variance there. There are also different points of entry. We've been talking, Jeremy, predominantly about engaging at the local level, typically the cities and design review boards, in a golf course conversion or something. I mean, any significant change in use is very likely to require an amendment to the land use plan, which is part of the comprehensive plan, which provides separate points of entry for negotiation or adversarial proceeding if you get there. So your question was fairly broad, Donna, about changes in use, but we're certainly going to look at a comprehensive plan for consistency. Jeremy mentioned that on in terms of you and making arguments. And just to go back, I know we want to press forward and time's limited. On the view, typically there is no guaranteed right to a view. We find in practice that through engagement, developers are more and more agreeable, and cities and local governments tend to require viewing corridors. Now, what is a better or the best viewing corridor is sometimes subjective, and one association or one property owner nearby may not have the same opinion. But just because there's no right to view, doesn't mean you don't have a right to object, or doesn't mean you have, free speech rights to go ahead and become engaged. And I think that with associations, the common theme to this seminar is, what's your level of engagement? What's your level of preparation? Are you prepared? Are you active? Are you engaged with us, with your local government representatives? And those are it's that level of engagement really is going to have a direct effect on your ability and leverage to negotiate, and what the local government officials that are going to be deciding these issues are apt to do.
That's a perfect segue, Kevin, to what I want to ask Katie. So Katie, we know the noise and the debris is going to stop at some point. When the construction stops, that's going to stop. But what are some of the long-term consequences associations need to be thinking about?
Absolutely. And some things that associations tend to overlook, especially if it's a restaurant or business type space next to residential, is also outdoor amplified music and hours related to that. It's similar to the squawk box for drive-through restaurants, but also operational things that will tend to be a nuisance over time for the residents. We've seen those garage style doors for restaurants lately to get a lot of fresh air. But if part of their zoning approval is going to allow them live music performance and things of that nature indoors, then that sort of door that you might not even think about being a problem will, because for the operation hours, that music's going to be coming out loud and clear to the exterior. And similarly, easements that get effectuated as part of the proposed development. That might not be something at the forefront of the association's mind. But for example, I saw in city of Sarasota, the city was requiring that they have an easement for beach access, and our client was directly next door. So thankfully, we were involved early enough in the process to suggest that should be on the farthest side from our client's property. And it made sense from a practical level because there was already an easement in place, not terribly far from this location. So it ended up being a location that made better sense and was most protective of our clients. So folks weren't coming and going with kayaks and surfboards and all their beach equipment and things right next to their first floor unit owners.
And sometimes it's really hard, Katie, to know what the ultimate problem might be. For instance, I had a client, the next door construction was a new marina. And they thought, okay, marina, how bad could it be? Well, after 2 years, the owner of that marina brought in a party boat. And it would come in, and this party boat operated throughout the week as well. And they'd be pulling into that marina 1, 2, 3 in the morning with the music going and the strobe lights and everything. And so it's often difficult to know down the road how that usage is going to morph.
Absolutely. And I think that underscores the point of getting sophisticated legal counsel who has experience in this space to help triage what's the application and kind of forecast what the additional issues will be. Because some of those issues exceed the scope of review for the city and county, depending on what type of application they're pursuing. But an attorney can help advise you what to look for and what should be a part of that memorandum of understanding or coming to terms, however you want to categorize it. I think some other things that don't necessarily get considered are restoring any damage to the association property that could result as part of construction on the property next door. If they're excavating and there's debris that's flying and it damages a unit window or common element window in the lobby, things of that nature, and also holding harmless the association. For example, if they're amenable as part of this compromise to serve as a staging area for construction, we want to make sure the association is protected from any claims that arise from the construction itself for which the association is not responsible.
Well, that's not something that's going to happen as a matter of right. If the association or neighboring property is going to be used as a staging area, that's going to be negotiated. Right.
Well, oh, go ahead, Kevin. I'm sorry.
No. I was just you had made a comment. I wanted to pick up on it. I mean, I think in general, if there's physical damage to property, there's going to be liability for the people that caused it, whether it's a developer or your neighbor's son that hits a baseball through your window. So if there's damage, it's going to be compensated. But I think some people may have perked up and said, wait, our property is going to be used as a staging area for the construction next door.
But as part of the quid pro quo, yes, but as part of the compromise, there's going to be concessions made on both sides potentially. So if that's one brokering tool that you're offering, if it's spatially constrained, if you're going to allow them to stage equipment or what have you, as part of a covenant running with the land or a memorandum of understanding that's binding on the developer today and successor developers, it's important to make sure that all of those things get accounted for and are spelled out very clearly for the benefit of all parties going forward too. And that
to be consideration for that compromise.
Yep, absolutely.
I see Kevin smiling, thinking about about the consideration. Katie, anything else before we move on off that point?
I think it's also important to note that the agreement, once written out, needs to also include that any disputes under that agreement are, well, that the agreement itself is interpreted under the laws of Florida, because a lot of these developer entities are incorporated in Delaware or elsewhere. And then also any disputes arising under that agreement are settled in the county where the association is located. So they're not having to send legal counsel to Delaware or California or wherever. And then it should also speak to the ongoing maintenance of some of these items as well. Stormwater, the developer is almost always responsible for, they're responsible for impact fees to help mitigate impacts to schools and traffic and things of that nature. But where it's a shared stormwater system, you want to make sure that the delineation of responsibility is also clear for the benefit of all going forward.
So I know as the association attorney, those are all great points. And Jeremy, I want to ask you to jump in about what you put in your agreements. But I know I'm going to get asked by the client, does the board alone have the authority to enter into such an agreement? Or do we need to take it to the members? In some of our communities, there's been a pattern of practice in place where the members think that they're entitled to be consulted on every decision the board needs to make. In this case, more often than not, the board alone has the authority to enter into this kind of an agreement when neighboring construction is going up. I say that with the caveat that you should always get legal advice from your association attorney to determine the scope of the board's authority. There may be something in your particular governing documents that would require some sort of membership input. But Jeremy, let me take it over to you. I want to give you an example because this actually happened in one of my communities. Developers tend to build more than one building, right? Because they're kind of in the business of doing that. So in my case, it was a developer and he had purchased the parcels on either side of the first community he developed. And he went to the board and basically said, you're going to love everything I do. So when I was talking to the board president, he said, well, the developer told us we're going to love it. So, and he's done a good job with our building. So we think he's going to love it. Verbal agreement, okay, sufficient to calm everyone's concerns?
Well, obviously not. I mean, the client should do its own due diligence and, retain a land use attorney to, pull all of the approvals. Many times, the original approvals may include both of the sites. So it may impact, future, rights of the existing building, of the client. But it's trust but verify. So, sure, maintain those friendly relations. But at the end of the day, you want to do your due diligence, pull all the approvals, pull all the plans. We had an interesting case actually a few years ago where, the developer it wasn't the same developer of the community, but they had, had a bunch of public participation meetings with their client, showed them all these beautiful renderings, and then lo and behold, submitted something that was completely different. And, we did some research and, renderings are not legally binding. It's the plans themselves. So, you just have to be very careful. Another sort of trick of the trade is that, sometimes an application will be submitted and it seems like it's a minor application, but, they submit it and then, they maybe obtain something administratively or, just sort of, feed something to the client and make it seem like it's very minor. But, then when that period of time has lapsed, that they, are within, a certain, ceiling so that they don't trigger other requirements, they go ahead and apply for another modification. And then another year passes and they apply for another modification. So it is really important to keep your ear to the ground to, for sure, maintain friendly relations. But, like I said, trust but verify.
Really good advice. Now, Katie really laid out a very comprehensive agreement. Is there anything you would add in terms of what you'd like to see in those agreements?
Well, Katie was very comprehensive. I was going through my checklist and I mean, she knocked off a lot of them. I'll just reiterate some of the things, ingress, egress during construction, what are the roads that are affected or potential, alleys, some alleys may be vacated and end up being part of the development. The maintenance of traffic plan, which will be from the city, which will, outline, what's going to happen during construction. Storage of construction equipment, security on the premises. I think that's important. What type of fencing will they have? Making sure that the GC is taking, common sense measures to prevent, trash and litter and things like that. Definitely the dust and debris. But dust and debris can, impact, the facade. It can impact a parking garage, depending upon the location of where that is. It could be a safety issue, so you want to make sure you have some sort of netting system in place to,
Dust and debris can impact the association's equipment.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. If you have a common amenity area that's below, where ultimately the, development is building. And to that point, the location and types of cranes that are being used, the jib of the cranes, whether live loads will swing over the property. Just trying to think what else. Impact on landscaping. Definitely, as Katie mentioned, location of potential nuisances like, dumpsters, noisy equipment like, generators and AC equipment. If there's shared parking, will parking spaces or guest parking spaces be impacted?
Shared
You know,
irrigation and drainage?
Yep. Yep, definitely. And then, even, more esoterically, but, the impact on the approvals, so, like I mentioned, it may have been part of a, larger development approval in the past. So, if the developer is coming in here, he may be impacting your future development rights. That may impact more like, office buildings, but it really just depends. And then back to your point about the golf courses, we have negotiated in the past to maintain through a restrictive covenant, large amounts of acreage as open space. So for instance, an association may be split, like, do we support it? Do we oppose it? What do we do? Because the golf course isn't financially feasible anymore. And, sometimes we have, negotiated in the past, all right, developer goes ahead and builds, the multifamily or townhome or single family home community. But in exchange for that, they maintain, the open areas, and they have a, restrictive covenant, or even a condition of approval in the approval itself, that open space is maintained in perpetuity. So, everybody sort of rests easy at the end of the day.
What do you all build into your agreement, assuming you've got this great agreement, now the developer breaches it?
Well, that's where the bulldog comes out, Kevin Markow.
Oh, boy.
I don't know about that. I mean, breaches come in all different shapes, colors, and sizes. If there's a breach, then there's going to be enforcement rights. I don't know at what point the breach would reveal itself. I mean, obviously, if there's an agreement that we've prepared, we're going to be able to go to court. We're going to be able to seek damages in the event that there are financial damages. Perhaps injunctive relief if it's something that rises to the level of irreparable harm. For instance, Jeremy just said, live loads on cranes swinging over your property. If it was, prohibited under a construction agreement, then we're seeing cranes that we don't think are safe. And I'm just using it as an example, flying over our property, and we documented it. I mean, that's something that we may want to run to court and try to get an emergency injunction for. Presumably, there's going to be a prevailing party attorney's fee provision in any agreement that we prepare on behalf of with the developer, on behalf of any of our clients in these situations. So, hopefully we won't have to come out of pocket, assuming that we're correct and the agreement has been breached. But there's always redress. But hopefully, we haven't suffered any significant damages, and that we're going to need to get involved in protracted litigation. We're going to assume that after an arm's length negotiation, that the developer is going to perform in good faith, and so are we. But in the event that that doesn't happen, obviously we're going to preserve and enforce our clients' rights.
Well, Kevin, as long as I've got you talking, I'm gonna lob a question we received at you. Should an association, let me make sure I'm reading this question correctly, what's the best way to document pre-construction site conditions? So is date stamped photos and date stamped video sufficient, or should they take the extra step to get an engineer out to document their community's condition before the construction commences next door?
I'm going to say yes to all of that. And that's a little bit of a cop-out answer. What I'm going to do, not being a construction specialist myself, is talk to one of my construction partners. Obviously, the answer will vary depending on the property and the project next door. I will tell you that in many of the recent agreements that we've been involved in, the discussions, developers, certainly in a post-Champlain Tower South world, the developers have been eager and receptive to paying for pre-construction surveys because, frankly, it protects them too. It protects the developer from later claims saying you damaged the foundation. And by doing, and look at all the litigation that spawned out of that. So it makes good sense to do the pre-construction survey and have the engineers involved. But not every project is the same. I would imagine there are circumstances where recordings and date timestamp photographs would be adequate. But absent specific circumstances, I don't know, but I would almost certainly be consulting with one of our construction team members to, to help steer my advice as well.
Good advice. So for the whole panel, this is what we hear often. Who's going to pay for this? There's certainly concern on the part of associations when construction goes up next door, but more often than not, they don't want to come out of pocket on anything. Okay. Even the thought, and I think you touched on this, Kevin, even the thought of hiring counsel is to many, paralyzing, because they don't even want to get involved. They know there can be problems. They know they have rights that should be protected, but they just don't want to take the next step because they're afraid of spending any money. So who pays for all this? Well, Kevin, you just touched on it. It's in the developer's interest more often than not to pay for an engineering report on the neighboring communities. Who pays to prepare the agreement? Can we touch on that a little bit?
Well, we don't know. We know what we'd like the answer to be, right? We know what we want, that of course the other guy's going to pay our fees or pay for the association's fees or the property owner, but it's all subject to a negotiation. But I'll tell you what's most likely to happen if a neighboring property owner sits on their hands and doesn't become involved. They're going to lose leverage. They're not going to have much of a voice and an impact on what's ultimately approved. So, by getting involved, by becoming engaged, you have the ability to influence the process. Don't think, and this is probably, I'm steering into what would have been my closing remarks, but you asked, and it's leading me here, so I'll say it. But if a community is apathetic to a proposed development, the site plan approval to rezoning, the decision makers, probably elected officials at the city or county level, are going to notice that. And developers typically have lobbyists, and we represent developers, and we lobby on behalf of them. And in the face of no opposition, I think that the assumption is going to be that there is approval or tacit approval. On the other side, an association or a property owner that doesn't want to make the investment to engage in discussions, to have their voice heard, risks missing out, risks not being able to influence what's, what ultimately is approved. I mean, look, I started off my comments by saying property owners, developers have rights too. A project may come in that is aesthetically compatible, that doesn't require a variance, that meets the density, that is consistent with the comprehensive land use plan. That's a project that most of the time should be approved and is going to be approved. But even if that's the scenario, that doesn't mean you can't influence the process. That doesn't mean the developer doesn't want to be a good neighbor. Maybe they're going to need some cooperation on certain things, whether it's staging, whether it's just something that they want to integrate some utilization, some function with your property. So none of that is possible unless you get engaged and get at it.
Right. So let's stick with that though. Let's say it's a good project. It's a project that everybody in the existing community is really excited about. Katie, Jeremy, do you put a requirement in your agreement for almost like a security deposit? Put some money in escrow, whether it's 50,000, depending on the size of the project, the new construction, to cover anything going wrong, right? Because we even do that in our associations. Somebody's renting a unit, we take a common area security deposit in case the tenant, crashes into a tree or what have you. Tell me about what you're putting away, if you're requiring the developer to put certain monies in escrow pending completion of the project, which would be returned if there's no damage.
Well, and Donna, how I've seen it in my agreements mostly has been community improvement funds. So in other words, everyone's excited about the project. It's really going to elevate the value on a unit by unit basis or home by home basis when that project is completed. And the developer actually wants to see similar improvements made in older adjacent buildings. So it's on par with the new development that everyone's excited about. So we've had escrow funds held for roof improvements, pressure washing when construction is all said and done, repainting. So everyone in the neighborhood is benefiting from that increase of value, and they're not damaged by the construction process next door as well. And holding those funds for a period of 8 or 10 years, so the association can dip into those as the improvements need to happen. And then the developer shares in that elevation neighborhood
I
wide.
want people to understand what you just said, that some developers are willing to give money to neighboring community to improve that neighboring community.
Yes, so that way their project is not disadvantaged by having older buildings.
By looking at your
that
next
are-
door eyesore.
Correct. So, and so on a unit by unit basis, that's less money they have to spend on a special assessment or what have you. And then it creates a uniformity in that neighborhood as well. And we've also seen in terms of the developer making landscaping improvements for screening, if they don't have enough setback area to do hedges or a perimeter wall or something attractive like that, they'll offer to either install it or at least finance it on the association property. And then it would be the responsibility of the association as part of the common elements or common areas to maintain, but at least it's an improvement over what otherwise would have been before having started that conversation with the developer. My line of thought is always, my mom taught me, if you don't ask, you don't get. And everything's a negotiation, to Kevin's point. So nothing's off the table and everything's open for discussion.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Yep, there's a lot of truth behind that. Jeremy, do you ever do, what do you put in terms of monetary compensation in your agreements?
Well,
Let me jump in on that real quick, because it's a sensitive issue, and I think that, you know, developer clients hear monetary demands, and you know, you hear the term or accusations of extortion and things of that nature, and it's an ugly word, and it usually it's you know, a term to the negative. I would advise all of our clients that would oppose that we need to be able to link any potential payments to actual impacts. That's the way that experienced developers, attorneys are going to want to frame the issue and are going to understand to negotiate it. It's not just a matter of, you know, we're going to show up in a bunch of red shirts and oppose your project, which seemingly you have a right to build unless you pay us $1 million. That's not a negotiation that we're going to really be a part of. But to the extent that, you know, that the quality of life of our residents is going to be impacted over a sustained period of time, there's dust and debris, you know, those impact payments can be along the lines of, I think Jeremy or Katie said, you know, pressure washing, painting, landscaping, repaving. But to me, the key is if you're going to demand money, you've got to be able to link it to actual mitigation, actual impacts.
Agreed. You can't just go in there with a wish list. There has to be some nexus. Jeremy, anything to add?
no, I think Kevin and Katie really covered it comprehensively.
So let's just, and we're guys, we only have about 10 minutes left here, so we got a lot more territory to cover. Kevin, tell us about who has standing to even get involved. You know, if the board's not willing to, can an ad hoc group of owners decide that they want to get involved in this process?
Yeah, believe it or not, but without saying the word, Jeremy really covered standing really at the outset here when he was talking about the notice, who is required to get notice. So that 300 to 500 feet, look, you're always going to have standing if you are an adjacent property owner. If you are within the range that the code mandates receive notice, you're going to have standing. The legalese to establish standing is you have to be adversely affected more than the public in general. You have to have some unique injury or stake in the outcome of the project. But as a general rule, adjacent or really nearby adjacent, and certainly within that statutory range. Now, there may be other levels and elements of standing. For instance, if an ordinance or a land use amendment is, let's say, unconstitutional for whatever reason, the net of standing is going to be broader because the legislative process, which is impacted, affects, you know, more of the citizenship at large. But if you're talking about a site-specific site plan approval, you have to show some unique adverse impact, and usually within that range that we discussed.
Okay, great.
Donna, it's important to know your opportunity for standing at the level that Jeremy and I, at the quasi judicial level for these rezoning actions as well. For some jurisdictions, you're afforded equal time to the applicant to speak. So just like a board meeting, there's sometimes time constraints on how long an owner can speak on an agenda item. Likewise, the general public is usually constrained to 3 or 5 minutes, depending on the jurisdiction. But if you have standing to oppose an application due to proximity, or the adverse effects, if it's approved, are greater in degree than the public generally, then you can be afforded equal time, depending on the jurisdiction, to the applicant.
Good advice. One word of advice from me to our listeners would be, this needs to be a board decision. Okay, this is where communication is going to be key. This is not, it should not just be a single board member that's taking it upon himself or herself to oppose the neighboring construction. Your fellow directors may not feel the same way, or, you know, vice versa, to support the neighboring construction, and you're, you know, the majority of your fellow board members and residents don't feel the same way. Communication is going to be key on this in terms of how your community wants to address construction next door. Jeremy, I'm going to start with you, but this is
I'm sorry. When you said that about disagreements, it reminded me that I didn't answer your question about ad hoc committees. Yeah, we do work with ad hoc committees. They would have the same standing as the association itself, or any individual unit owner or member of the association. So there are times, you know, and it can be a heavy load to carry. But there are times that the board doesn't want to take up the mantle of opposition, or there is disagreement in terms of the benefit of what's going on. But if you meet that definition that I previously gave in terms of standing as an individual on your own as part of an ad hoc committee, you can assert the same rights, yes.
Are you saying that not everyone's on the same page in the community association?
Well, I haven't seen it, but I've heard rumors.
You've heard rumors of it, right? So this is for the entire panel, but I'm going to start with you, Jeremy. What are some of the things that boards and managers do which hinder your ability, the three of you, to negotiate with the developer?
Right, and I mean, so I want to touch on the theme that, you know, has sort of been prevalent throughout this webinar, which is that, you know, you really have to come in early. You know, notice is important, but you have to come in early. If you think that you're going to show up at a city commission hearing after the project's gone through development review committee and has the recommendation of approval by all the disciplines, and the city manager has a recommendation of approval by the planning and zoning manager, planning and zoning board, and then it's being heard at the city commission, you think you're going to show up there. I mean, that's like trying to stop a snowball that's, you know, already been, you know, rolling, you know, downhill for a long time. So it's very important to, you know, come in early, because that's where your leverage, you know, where you have the most leverage, and you can impact, you know, the design of the site plan, or, you know, what's being requested. But to your current point, Donna, what do property managers or boards do? I mean, I think it's important to, you know, speak as one voice in public. You know, residents are free to do what they want to do. We have no control over residents, but as a board, as a community, as the fiduciary of the community, it's very important that the board speaks with one voice. It is, you know, really important, I think, that the board, you know, also, you know, communicates properly with the residents, so that they, you know, don't think that they're, you know, trying to cover something up. You know, they're kept apprised of every step. And yeah, definitely keeping track of those notices. You know, if the property managers are the ones receiving those notices, you have to send it to us right away. You know, we can't be alerted to, you know, a hearing a day in advance or something like that. So really, time is your friend and your enemy in this matter.
Katie, anything boards and managers inadvertently do that make your job harder?
Absolutely. And I underscore Jeremy's point. The biggest offense is dawdling. And sometimes by the time you're mobilized, it's too late and you no longer have standing. For example, here in Lee County, if you don't object at the hearing examiner level, which is comparable to the planning commission and some other places, you cannot speak at the commission hearing. You've lost your chance. So it's very important to get engaged early. I think another thing is making sure that your mailing address in Sunbiz is correct, but also the property appraiser, because that's where they're pulling notice to the association and the individual owner. So they want to you want to make sure it's going to the right place. If you've changed management companies, make sure that's current with respect to mailing address. And in Collier County, also civic associations and community associations generally can also register with the planning and zoning department for notice. So instead of being at the mercy of your residents receiving notice in that particular radius, if you proactively register with your local jurisdiction to make sure that they have the name and mailing address for the president and also the manager, that's a great thing to be sure is in place well in advance of development next door. And I think the other challenge is just boards being reasonable, to Kevin's point, not being outright anti-development, but identifying the opportunities for compromise and things that would improve the project and make it more palatable for the majority of your members. Because we've talked a little bit about the infighting. One building might be more impacted than another, but the board's job is to really look out for the membership at large, and they'll have to be cognizant of the impacts across the association, not just for a particular unit owner or building.
Thanks, Katie. Kevin? What's been done to you to make your job harder?
Well, and you know, every now and then I have some colleagues that write big checks, but nobody, when I say that is create unrealistic expectations that we're somehow miracle workers, but nobody on this panel has ever done that to make. No, I think that Jeremy and Katie had done a great job. Just early engagement. The longer you wait, the less maneuverability we have, the less leverage we have, and the more likely we're going to be in a scenario where we're asking, if not begging, you know, saying pretty please, as opposed to having a level-headed discussion among equally matched parties.
I think we all agree in today's webinar that we're going to see more construction going up, particularly associated with association terminations, particularly along the coastline with the requirements of the new SB 4D, what we're calling the condominium safety law, really kicking in, the upcoming deadlines for milestone inspections, the new structural integrity reserve studies, and everything else associated with maintaining and repairing older coastal communities. I want to thank all the panelists today. Thanks, you guys. You've given some great information out there. All of our panelists can be reached. Well, here we go. Here's where you can reach all of us. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Donna.
Thanks, guys.